All right, so we're diving deep into Mark Twain's The Adventures of Tom Sawyer this time around.
That's right.
We've got all sorts of stuff to work with here.
Uh-huh.
Summaries, character analyses, even some guidance on how to make video summaries from this book.
Okay.
But our real goal is to really get to the heart of what makes this book a classic and why it still resonates with readers today.
That's a really interesting challenge. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer is set in the pre-Civil War era,
Okay.
in the fictional town of St. Petersburg, Missouri.
Right on the banks of the Mississippi?
Yes, exactly. And it follows the escapades of the imaginative and mischievous boy, Tom Sawyer, who lives with his Aunt Polly and her family.
So, like, right off the bat, in the first few chapters, what is Twain throwing at us?
Well, you see Tom's rebellious nature right away.
Oh,
He skips school to go swimming.
uh-huh.
He gets in a fight and is punished with the dreaded chore of whitewashing a fence.
Yeah. I remember that fence scene.
Yes.
Doesn't he, like, manipulate his friends into doing it for him?
He does. He's very clever. And able to manipulate others, he convinces his friends that whitewashing is actually a privilege.
Oh, wow.
And they end up doing the job for him, and they even pay him for the honor.
That's classic Tom Sawyer, right?
Yes.
Always able to kind of get out of trouble or at least turn it to his advantage.
Exactly.
What about his love life? I know there's a certain Becky Thatcher that he has his eye on.
Yes. Becky Thatcher, Tom, becomes very smitten with her
Sure.
and tries to win her over with different displays of affection and bravado. Their relationship is a little bit of a roller coaster,
As those things tend to be.
full of misunderstandings and reconciliations.
Yeah. And of course, there's Huckleberry Finn.
Yes,
Such a contrast to Tom.
absolutely. Huck is the quintessential outcast. He's free from the constraints of society.
He's the symbol of freedom.
Exactly, freedom and rebellion.
Yeah.
And his friendship with Tom really represents that yearning for a life outside of societal norms.
So it sounds like we've got some interesting contrasts that Twain is setting up here.
Yeah.
What comes next?
Well, the plot takes a little bit of a darker turn
Okay.
when Tom and Huck witness a murder in the graveyard late one night.
Oh, wow.
It's Injun Joe,
Yeah.
a very menacing figure with a grudge against society.
Right.
He kills Dr. Robinson and frames Muff Potter for the crime.
So now we've got a murder mystery on top of all this.
Yes, quite a bit of suspense is added.
Yeah, so how do they react to this? I mean, they're just kids.
They're terrified naturally,
Yeah,
and they swear a blood oath to never reveal what they saw.
because they're afraid of Injun Joe.
Exactly. They fear his revenge, and the weight of this secret really weighs heavily on them.
Right, so do they try to just forget about it and carry on with their lives?
To some extent, they do.
Okay.
They run away to Jackson's Island.
Right.
They pretend to be pirates.
Right.
And they enjoy a brief escape from the pressures of their everyday lives.
Right.
But the memory of that murder lingers,
Yeah.
and their consciences begin to trouble them.
Yeah, it's interesting how Twain blends this kind of lighthearted adventure with this darker undercurrent of fear and guilt.
Yes.
So, what happens next? Do they eventually confront Injun Joe?
Not directly. Their sense of justice compels them to act, but in a more subtle way.
Right.
When Muff Potter's trial begins,
Uh-huh.
Tom can't bear to see an innocent man condemned.
So he breaks his oath
Yes,
and testifies against Injun Joe.
he does. It's a very dramatic courtroom scene.
Wow.
It's a risky move,
Yeah.
but he ultimately chooses to do what he believes is right.
Right.
Even if it means putting himself in danger.
That's a big step for Tom.
It is.
Shows real growth in his character.
Definitely.
So what happens to Injun Joe after Tom's testimony?
Injun Joe manages to escape.
Oh, no.
During the commotion, leaving Tom and Huck to live in fear of his retribution.
Right.
The story then shifts gears a bit, and Tom and Becky Thatcher become the focus.
Okay, back to the romance.
Yes.
What happens with them?
Well, during a school picnic, Tom and Becky get lost in McDougal's cave, a vast and intricate labyrinth.
Oh, okay.
And their disappearance causes quite a panic in the town. A massive search effort is launched.
That sounds terrifying.
It is.
I bet this is where those instructions for video summaries come in handy.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine trying to depict the claustrophobia and desperation of being lost in a cave.
Yeah.
It's a very visually rich and suspenseful episode in the story.
So how do they escape?
Well, Tom, with his usual mix of luck and resourcefulness,
Of course.
discovers a small opening that leads them out of the cave.
Oh, wow.
They return to the town as heroes,
Okay.
but their ordeal has a lasting impact, especially on Becky.
Yeah, what about Injun Joe? Does he factor into this at all?
He does, and in a very dramatic way,
Okay.
to prevent future accidents, Judge Thatcher, Becky's father, orders the entrance to the cave sealed.
Uh-huh.
Unknowingly, Injun Joe is trapped inside.
Oh, no.
Yes, a pretty grim fate.
Yeah, so what happens next?
Well, we'll have to dive into that in the next part, but keep in mind this is just the first half of the book. There's plenty more adventure to come. So we left off with Injun Joe trapped in McDougal's cave.
Right. A fitting end for a villain, you might say.
You would think so.
But what about Tom and Huck? Where do their adventures go from there?
Well, their adventures certainly aren't over yet. Shortly after their harrowing experience in the cave, they set off on a treasure hunt.
Oh, that's right. They overheard Injun Joe discussing his hidden loot.
Exactly, and driven by their adventurous spirits and their dreams of riches,
Of course.
they head to the haunted house where they believe the treasure is hidden.
So back in familiar territory, but I imagine Injun Joe's absence doesn't make their task any easier.
You're right. Finding the exact location of the treasure proves to be quite the challenge.
Uh-huh.
They dig and search for days,
Okay.
but their efforts seem to be in vain.
So they come up empty-handed?
Yeah.
What happens next?
Well, while they're busy searching for Injun Joe's loot, a new development unfolds. Huck, who's been keeping an eye on the widow Douglas's house, overhears a conversation that chills him to the bone.
Hold on, why is Huck watching the widow Douglas? I thought he was preoccupied with the treasure hunt.
Well, Huck's sense of loyalty runs deep. You know?
Right.
Remember, widow Douglas showed him kindness and he feels indebted to her?
Right.
So he's been secretly watching over her, making sure she's safe.
Okay, that's pretty noble of him. What did he overhear?
He discovers that Injun Joe has escaped from the cave.
Oh, no.
And is now plotting revenge against the widow Douglas.
Oh, wow.
Huck knows he has to act fast
Of course.
and sets off to get help.
So now there's a race against time to save the widow Douglas.
Absolutely.
So what does Huck do?
Well, he knows he can't confront Injun Joe alone, so he seeks help from the Welshman who lives on the outskirts of town.
Okay.
Together, they alert the authorities and set out to stop Injun Joe.
So what happens?
Well, the townspeople arrive just in time to prevent Injun Joe from carrying out his plan.
Okay.
He manages to escape once again, but his defeat marks a turning point in the story.
It sounds like Injun Joe's luck is finally running out. Where does this leave Tom?
Well, Tom, meanwhile, is still fixated on finding the treasure. He returns to the cave, this time with Huck, and they eventually discover Injun Joe's hidden loot.
So they finally strike gold. What do they do with your newfound riches?
Well, the treasure is invested for them, ensuring their financial security.
Wow.
But more importantly, their adventure has brought them closer together, solidifying their bond of friendship.
It's interesting how the treasure, which initially seemed so important, almost becomes secondary to the experiences that they share.
Yes.
What about Injun Joe? Is that the last we see of him?
Sadly, no. His story comes to a rather tragic end. Sometime later, Tom and Huck return to the cave for another exploration.
Oh, this sounds ominous. What happens?
They discover that the entrance to the cave has been sealed and Injun Joe's body is found inside.
Oh, wow.
He apparently starved to death, trapped in the darkness.
That's a grim ending for him. It seems like justice was served, albeit in a rather unexpected way.
It is a reminder that even the most cunning villains can't escape the consequences of their actions. And for Tom and Huck, it brings a sense of closure to a chapter filled with fear and danger.
So with Injun Joe gone and the treasure found, are Tom and Huck's adventures finally over?
Well, the story doesn't quite end there. We still have the resolution of Huck's situation. Remember, he's been living a life of freedom, unburdened by societal expectations.
Right, he's the ultimate symbol of the free spirit.
Exactly.
What happens to him?
The widow Douglas, grateful for his role in saving her life, decides to adopt Huck, offering him a stable and loving home.
Oh, wow, that sounds like a happy ending. But how does Huck react to this sudden change in his lifestyle?
He struggles at first, you see.
Yeah.
He's used to his independence, and he finds it difficult to adjust to the rules and routines of a conventional household.
Right, it must be a difficult transition for him going from a life of complete freedom to a more structured environment.
Absolutely. But Tom, ever the loyal friend, comes to the rescue.
Yep.
He convinces Huck that even within the confines of civilization, there's room for adventure and excitement. He promises to help him form a robber band,
Classic Tom.
appealing to Huck's sense of rebellion and adventure.
Yeah, does Huck eventually come around to this idea of living with the widow Douglas?
He does, albeit reluctantly. The story ends with Huck accepting his new life, but with the understanding that he can still retain his sense of individuality and freedom. You know, it's interesting how Huck's adoption by the widow Douglas kind of highlights this theme of civilization versus freedom.
Yeah, right. She represents this stable, respectable life, but it's also a bit stifling for Huck at first.
Exactly. He's so used to being on his own, doing whatever he wants.
But Tom doesn't let him stay miserable for too long, right?
No, not at all. He comes up with the idea of forming a robber band.
Oh, yeah, of course.
which appeals to Huck's sense of adventure and rebellion and ultimately helps him adjust to his new life.
It's like Twain is saying, you can find a balance, you know?
Mhm.
You can have a place in society without completely losing your wild side.
Right, and I think that's a message that still resonates today, you know? We all struggle with those pressures to conform, but it's important to remember who we are at our core.
So looking back at the entire story, what would you say are some of the key takeaways from The Adventures of Tom Sawyer?
Well, I think one of the most important is the power of friendship.
Right. Tom and Huck go through so much together.
They do, they support each other through thick and thin, and their bond is really unbreakable.
And I think the Mississippi River itself plays a pretty significant role, too.
Absolutely. It's more than just a setting. It's like a symbol of freedom and adventure.
It's that constant pull towards the unknown.
Exactly, and it represents the possibilities that lie beyond the confines of their small town.
Another thing that struck me is how Twain uses humor to deal with some pretty serious themes.
Oh, yeah, he tackles issues like racism and social injustice, but he does it in a way that's both insightful and entertaining,
Yeah, it's like he's able to make us laugh and think at the same time.
right? And that's a real testament to his skill as a writer.
So overall, would you say that The Adventures of Tom Sawyer is still relevant for readers today?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a timeless classic that captures the essence of childhood and the challenges of growing up.
It's a story that stays with you.
It does, and I think it reminds us to never lose sight of our inner child, that sense of wonder and adventure that we all have inside.
Well said. I think we've covered just about everything in this deep dive into The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Any final thoughts for our listener?
Just this, if you haven't read this book in a while, or if you've never read it at all, I highly encourage you to give it a try. It's a story that will stay with you long after you finish the last stage.
Couldn't agree more. And on that note, until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those imaginations running wild.